Early on January 15th, 1974, I arrived at 803 North Edgemoor Street in Wichita, Kansas. The quiet of the residential street contrasted sharply with what I found inside. The entire Otero family had been murdered, strangled, suffocated, their bodies arranged as if the killer had taken his time. There was Joseph Otero, the father, 38 years old, his hands and feet bound tightly. His wife, Julie Otero, 33, lay near him in the same tortured position. Their children, Josephine, just 11 years old, and Joseph Jr., only 9, were found nearby. Josephine had been hung by the neck in the basement, her small body still swinging when I saw her. It was the kind of scene that stays with you. Whoever had done this was no ordinary killer. There was something deeply sadistic about the way he operated. He had taken his time, binding them, torturing them, watching them die. It wasn't just murder, it was a game. We didn't know it then, but this was the beginning of a nightmare that would span 3 decades. The case went cold for a time. There were no leads, no suspects. The killer had left behind no fingerprints, no usable evidence, just 4 lifeless bodies and a sense of dread that hung over Wichita like a storm waiting to break. But it wasn't long before we learned that this was only the beginning. A few months later, a letter arrived at the local paper, crudely typed, taunting us. The killer identified himself as BTK for bind, torture, kill. He bragged about the Otero murders, described the horror in chilling detail, and made it clear that he wasn't done. He was just getting started. I had never dealt with anything like this before. The letters came sporadically, each one more disturbing than the last. He spoke of the thrill he felt during the murders, how he enjoyed the control, the power over life and death. We knew he was out there, watching us, waiting, but he left no trace, no clue to his identity. He was a ghost, moving in and out of his victims' lives without leaving a footprint, and the bodies kept coming. In 1977, Shirley Vian, a 24-year-old mother of 3, was found bound and strangled in her home. Her children had been locked in a bathroom, spared from their mother's fate. A few months later, Nancy Fox, 25, was discovered in her bedroom, her wrists tied, a belt wrapped tightly around her neck. BTK had struck again. We worked tirelessly to find him. I pored over the crime scenes, looking for anything that could give us a clue. Fibers, fingerprints, anything. But he was meticulous. He seemed to know how we operated, how we investigated, and he stayed one step ahead of us every time. It was maddening. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the killing stopped. Years went by, decades even, with no new victims. I never forgot the case. But as time passed, I started to wonder if he had disappeared for good. Maybe he had died or been locked up for something else. But deep down, I knew he was still out there, lurking in the shadows. In 2004, the nightmare came roaring back to life. BTK resurfaced, sending more letters, more taunts. He sent us photographs of one of his victims, Vicki Wegerle, who had been murdered in 1986. He described her death with the same detached cruelty he had used in the Otero case, detailing how he had broken into her home, bound her, and strangled her to death. It was a grim reminder that the killer who had haunted us for so long was still out there, and he hadn't forgotten us. We were determined to catch him this time, and now we had a tool that hadn't existed in the 70s, DNA evidence. We re-examined everything, going over the old crime scenes with a fine-tooth comb. DNA from Vicki Wegerle's crime scene was tested, and though it didn't match anyone in our system, it gave us something we had never had before, a genetic fingerprint of the BTK killer. But the break we needed came from the killer himself. In his arrogance, he had begun sending more and more communications, letters, photographs, even floppy disks. It was the disk that finally gave him away. The metadata on one of the disks led us to a church in Wichita, and from there to one of its most respected members, Dennis Rader, a seemingly ordinary man, a church leader, and a local compliance officer. It was hard to believe. Rader was a family man, well liked in the community, but when we brought him in and the DNA was a match, there was no doubt. Rader was BTK. I'll never forget sitting across from him during the interrogation. He was calm, almost proud, as he described the murders in detail. He talked about the thrill of binding his victims, of watching the fear in their eyes as they realized what was happening. He reveled in the control he had over their lives. He had planned every murder meticulously, sometimes stalking his victims for months before striking. The man who had haunted my nightmares for over 30 years turned out to be someone I would have never suspected. He was ordinary in every way, except for the monster lurking beneath the surface, A monster who had killed 10 people. A monster who had managed to live among us for decades, hiding in plain sight. Dennis Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms, one for each of his victims. But even as I watched him being led away in handcuffs, I couldn't shake the feeling that he had won in some small way. For years, he had lived in our heads, taunting us, outsmarting us. He had stolen not just the lives of his victims, but the peace of an entire city.